Welcome to Tower Bridge again, and very fittingly we are in one of the old drive cabins to look into the engineering side of the Cruttwell collection, and we've invited Gordon Masterton from the Institution of Civil Engineers, who's going to talk to us today. Gordon.
Happy to, Dirk, and it's fantastic to be here, isn't it? I'm Gordon Masterton, past president of the Institution of Civil Engineers, as was John Wolfe Barry sometime earlier. Also chair of the panel for historical engineering works of the institution that looks at engineering heritage as topics. Another connection is I'm a past master of the Worshipful Company of Engineers here in the City of London as part of the livery movement. And more recently, I was Professor of Future Infrastructure at University of Edinburgh.
To start with, Gordon, what does a civil engineer do? What is their role?
I'd like to think a civil engineer is first and foremost a professional with the competence and experience to give practical and meaningful advice on basically a sustainable and resilient future for the planet through the medium of infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I would mean the physical infrastructure that we see around us, like the Tower Bridge, Crossrail, things like that, or the natural infrastructure, the environment, increasingly important, that we also understand how to manage and mitigate the effects of what we do on nature. So the civil engineering is a very, very broad field.
Well, there's a reason why Tower Bridge looks like it looks and is at the place where it is now, because there were developments in the world, in the British Empire and so on, which made building a bridge here and now so essential.
Absolutely, Dirk. I mean, prior to this, of course, the lowest crossing of the Thames was on the site of the old London Bridge. It was by then the new London Bridge, the Rennie Bridge. But to the east, on both sides of the Thames, north and south, population had just built up tremendously because the trade that was centred around London had attracted so much new employment into the area, and manufacturing was building up as well, taking advantage of the Thames as an artery to the world, for trade and export and imports as well. So there was more and more pressure on another road crossing for both passengers and for mainly horse-drawn, but ultimately vehicles, at a more strategic part that was more convenient for the mass of people to the east of the new London Bridge. And lots of people had been talking about it from the 1860s, 1870s. City of London Corporation had a special subcommittee from 1876. So it all went to Parliament to sort out what was going to happen next. And they gave the job to the City of London Corporation to come up with a better solution. Quite quickly, actually, a couple of years, less than 2 years, they came up with a recommendation for what we would recognise as the Tower Bridge, as the compromise solution. It gave a headroom when the bascules were open of 140 feet or thereabouts. So that was fine for all of the masted ships to come up and still use the Pool of London, which was so important for London anyway. But it allowed through traffic at a low level that didn't require huge embanked approaches that would destroy big parts of London on either side. That's the trouble with a high-level bridge. It's the long and very high approaches. So this was the great compromise that allowed navigation and low-level road access.
It's interesting also that Tower Bridge is not just one bridge, it's a combination of different approaches, isn't it?
That's a good point, yes, that's true. For a bridge engineer especially, this is a master class in at least 4 different bridge types. The bascules, obviously, are commonly used for canals, the lifting bridges to allow navigation and vehicle coverage. Then, either side, the longer spans, the 2 side spans, are suspension bridges that run along the top of the towers within the walkways that are equilibrating the forces. So whatever you do, don't take those pins out, because that would be bad news for the suspension spans. So that's 2 types already. Then we have the high walkway, the girder themselves. It looks like a simple beam. It's not. It was built as cantilevering from the towers for a quarter of the way each side. and then a drop-in suspended span. So we would call it a cantilever and suspended span type structure. And then, of course, the approach viaducts leading up to the bridge proper are brick arches of a more conventional nature. So that's the fourth.
4 for the price of 1.
Very much.
Well, the interesting thing to me as working here is and as a historian, is also the organization behind it, which funded, financed, and still runs Tower Bridge, as well as the 4 other bridges in the city, which is the City Bridge Foundation. And that's based on, as you know, on the old Bridge House estates, which was originally responsible for the building and maintenance of London Bridge next door. And it is this organization which still runs Tower Bridge to this day, and therefore it comes at no cost to the taxpayer, which in itself, I think, in the context of such a project, is quite unique, and also the fact that it's for all eternity, as long as Tower Bridge stands or needs repairing, needs building, needs staffing, it will be maintained and run by the City Bridge Foundation.
Absolutely. And incredible foresight, really, from those who recognised when they'd first provided a substantial London Bridge that it's not enough just to invest the capital and leave it. Every piece of infrastructure needs to be maintained in perpetuity, because we can't go backwards, having enjoyed the benefits and the changes that arise from business being able to use it, and trade, and just social connections. Then it's unthinkable not to have it. So they had the foresight to say, well, if that's the case, we need to have a fund in order to maintain the continuity and perpetuity, as you say. It's fantastic.
That's what I always find interesting also about London, being an adopted Londoner and then chosen London as my home. This sort of mix between ancient tradition and the future, and this openness to build on the history to provide for the future.
Yeah, it does that very well. I have a phrase I coined for the work in the panel for historical engineering works, engineering foresight from hindsight. And the message there is that we need to recognise and understand the past, otherwise we're going to take the wrong decisions for the future.
Coming back to Edward Cruttwell, what's the role of a resident engineer today? Does his role still exist?
Today, the relationship's a bit nuanced in that sense. The resident engineer doesn't have as much power. He typically will not be approving the quality of all of the materials and the work that gets carried out. So there's a bit less power residing in the equivalent of the client's representative, but there is still a place for having the eyes and ears of the client and the eyes and ears of the design team, seeing what's happening on site. So it's not totally disappeared altogether, but in Cruttwell's time, the resident engineer was so important because the design team were very remote, and they would visit much more intermittently.
A thought experiment. If we were to rebuild Tower Bridge, or it weren't here and we started anew, how would we approach it? Would we come up with a similar solution?
If there was still that need for navigation, fairly high-level navigation, combined with a road crossing, then something like this is probably the right solution. I doubt if we would have the Italianate architectural ornamentation. That's very much of its time. And increasingly in rivers, as the hub of trade has moved, I mean, the Pool of London today doesn't have wall-to-wall ships or pier-to-pier, wharf-to-wharf ships. It's nothing like the same amount of usage. So the questions would be asked, is it really worth spending the extra money to have lifting spans in the middle to allow for navigation? If it did require a combination of low-level road with high-level navigation access, I think it would be something similar, but with a kind of streamlined, elegant form that was of our age rather than the Victorian age. But we love those ornate structures and piers as a relic of London.
Where did Tower Bridge, the project, stand in comparison with the other big Victorian projects?
The eyes of the country would be on it, that's for sure. And it would be regarded as a very significant project on which most contractors would want to work on, and engineers got great kudos out of being associated with it as well. So I think it's right up there amongst a handful of significant Victorian projects.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That was fascinating. It's interesting to think that this achievement, which sort of beautifully combines form and function, is still working to this day and still opening 800 to 1,000 times a year. And it's still run by the City Bridge Foundation. And in that respect, it also combines the sort of contribution to the urban infrastructure of London and this charitable aspect and the aspect of looking after the other 4 city bridges beautifully to this day. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, Dirk, absolutely pleasure, and great to be in this iconic space. Very steampunk. Yeah.